Some people inherit fortunes, some inherit names, and some inherit nothing at all except the determination never to be helpless again. The difference between those people is not always obvious at the beginning. In fact, at the beginning, it often looks like failure. A train station, a torn suitcase, a dying ranch, a 19-year-old orphan carrying everything she owns in a single bag. No fortune, no family name, no one waiting on the platform with flowers, no one expecting greatness. Just a young woman stepping down from a westbound train beneath the sky, so wide it seemed capable of swallowing every mistake a person had ever made. The year was 1887. The Colorado wind moved dust across the station platform in long, restless lines. Men unloaded freight. Railroad workers shouted to one another. A locomotive hissed and groaned like some great iron animal exhausted from crossing half a continent. And standing among all of it was Clara Whitmore, 19 years old, alone, entirely alone. The train that had carried her west had also carried the last familiar thing she possessed, the life she was leaving behind. She stood still for a moment after stepping onto the platform, not because she was frightened, at least not entirely, because there's a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when they realize there is no longer any road back, only forward, only whatever comes next. The leather handle of her suitcase was cracked. One corner had been repaired twice with stitching so careful and deliberate it looked almost artistic. The suitcase itself contained everything she owned. 3 dresses, 2 books, a photograph faded nearly white at the edges, and a small notebook she had carried since childhood. Nothing more. The station master glanced at her, then looked away. To him, she was simply another passenger, another arrival, another life crossing briefly through his day. He could not have known that 3 years later men would travel from neighboring counties seeking appointments with her. He could not have known that bankers would speak her name with caution, or that landowners who once laughed at her would eventually study her decisions the way gamblers study winning cards. Because at that moment, there was nothing remarkable about Clara Whitmore. Nothing except her eyes. People would remember those later. The eyes. Not because they were beautiful, though some would say they were, but because they carried the strange, steady look of someone who had learned very young that nobody was coming to save her, and had adjusted accordingly. The church in St. Louis had called the arrangement practical. Practical was a word adults often used when they wished to avoid saying something cruel. Practical meant there was one less orphan to feed. Practical meant a struggling rancher needed a wife. Practical meant 2 problems could be placed together and called a solution. The paperwork had taken less than a week. The decision even less. No one had asked Clara what she wanted. No one had considered that question particularly important. And Clara herself had long ago learned that wanting things was a dangerous habit. Wanting things often led to disappointment. Expecting things led to worse. So she stepped off the train with no expectations at all. Only determination. The sort that survives when everything else has been stripped away. A wagon waited near the edge of the station yard. The driver was an older man with weathered hands and a gray mustache that looked as though it had been shaped by decades of Colorado wind. He studied her for a moment. "You Clara Whitmore?" His voice was rough, but not unkind. "Yes." He nodded once. "Hart Ranch sent me." That was all. No welcome. No ceremony. No excitement. Just facts. Colorado was a place that respected facts. The wagon ride took nearly 2 hours. The town disappeared behind them. The railroad tracks vanished. The scattered buildings became open country. The mountains rose in the distance. Blue at first, then silver, then enormous. Clara sat quietly as the wagon rattled over uneven ground. The driver attempted conversation twice, failed both times. Eventually, he gave up and focused on the road. Clara didn't mind. Silence had been her companion for most of her life. She knew how to travel with it. The ranch appeared shortly before sunset. The first thing she noticed was the windmill, or rather, what remained of it. One blade hung crooked. Another was missing entirely. It turned unevenly against the sky. The second thing she noticed was the house. Paint peeling, porch sagging, windows needing repair. The third thing she noticed was the cattle. Too few. Far too few. Even without experience, she understood that. A ranch survives on numbers. And the numbers here look wrong. Very wrong. The driver stopped the wagon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he sighed. Not dramatically, just honestly. The way a man sighs when looking at something he wishes had turned out differently. Tough few years, he said. Clara followed his gaze. The ranch stretched across the fading light. Tired, worn, holding on. What happened? The driver hesitated, then shrugged. Bad weather. A pause. Bad luck. Another pause. Some bad decisions. He looked toward the house. And maybe too much grief. Clara said nothing, but she remembered those words. Bad weather, bad luck, bad decisions. Too much grief. Because sometimes people tell you everything you need to know without realizing they're doing it. The front door opened. A man stepped onto the porch. Tall, broad-shouldered, older than she expected. His movements carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting battles no one else could see. This was Samuel Hart, owner of the ranch, widower, 43 years old, and if local rumors were to be believed, approximately one bad season away from losing everything. He stood on the porch watching the wagon approach, not smiling, not unfriendly, simply cautious, as though life had taught him to greet new developments carefully. Clara climbed down from the wagon. The evening air carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. The mountain stood dark against the horizon. Samuel walked toward her, his boots slow against the dirt, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Two strangers, two damaged lives, two people brought together by circumstances neither had chosen. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was deep and steady. Mr. Hart. A brief silence settled between them. The windmill creaked somewhere behind the house. The sound carried across the ranch like an old complaint. Samuel glanced toward her suitcase, then back to her. You travel light. Clara looked at the worn bag in her hand. It's enough. Something flickered across his face. Not amusement, not pity, recognition. The kind that appears when one survivor unexpectedly recognizes another. The moment passed quickly, but it happened, and years later both of them would remember it. Because some stories announce themselves with fanfare, and some begin quietly. A glance, a sentence, a shared understanding neither person can yet explain. The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched across the ranch. The broken windmill turned again, slowly, unevenly, as if refusing to stop. Much like the ranch itself. Much like the man who owned it. Much like the young woman who had just arrived. The people who sent Clara Whitmore west believed they were solving a problem. The people who knew Samuel Hart believed they were postponing a foreclosure. Neither group understood what had truly arrived at Hart Ranch that evening. Neither group understood what Clara would see, what she would discover, or what she would eventually build. Because 3 years later, the same men who looked at this tired ranch and saw failure would be standing on land they desperately wanted. Land they could not buy. Land they could not develop. Land they could not touch. Without Clara Whitmore's permission. And the first step toward that future began here, on a quiet Colorado evening, with a broken windmill, a dying ranch, and an orphan carrying everything she owned in a single bag. The first thing Clara Whitmore learned about Hart Ranch was that nobody expected it to survive. The second thing she learned was that nobody expected her to survive it either. The Colorado morning arrived cold and clear the day after her arrival. Sunlight spilled across the valley. The mountain stood sharp against the sky, so blue it almost looked painted. Frost still clung to the fence posts. The windmill turned unevenly, one blade missing, another bent. The sound it made was not quite a squeak and not quite a groan, just a tired mechanical complaint repeated endlessly to anyone willing to listen. Clara noticed it immediately. She noticed everything. That had always been her way. Some children grow up learning how to play. Some grow up learning how to observe. Clara had spent most of her childhood doing the latter. Her parents had died during the winter epidemic of 1874. A harsh season. The kind old people still lower their voices when discussing years later. The snow had come early. The sickness had followed. By spring, entire families were gone. The Whitmores were among them. Clara remembered very little. Fragments mostly. Her mother's hands. Her father's laugh. A rocking chair near a fireplace. Small things. Memory has a habit of keeping the details it chooses. The church home in St. Louis had raised her afterward. Raised was perhaps the correct word. Loved was more complicated. The sisters had been kind. Some of them extraordinarily kind. But kindness and belonging are not always the same thing. Clara learned to sew, to read, to account for supplies, to stretch flour farther than seemed possible, to repair things instead of replacing them, to listen more than she spoke. Most importantly, she learned something many adults never learn at all. Resources are rarely the problem. Waste is. That lesson stayed with her. It followed her west, and on her first morning at Hart Ranch, it began quietly looking for work. Samuel was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. The ranch owner stood beside a corral gate, watching a ranch hand struggle with a loose section of fencing. The morning light revealed details the previous evening had hidden. The gray beginning to touch his temples, the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion that seemed woven permanently into his posture. Not weakness, never weakness, weariness. There is a difference. Samuel Hart had spent years carrying problems too heavy for one person. The weight showed. Clara leaned against the porch rail. The wood shifted slightly beneath her hand. Another thing that needed repair. Samuel glanced toward the house. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded. She nodded back. Neither seemed inclined toward unnecessary conversation before breakfast. Clara respected that. A few moments later, the ranch hand gave up on the fence section entirely. Samuel walked over himself, adjusted one hinge, moved one support beam, fixed the problem in less than 30 seconds. The young worker looked embarrassed. Samuel simply handed him the hammer. No shame in learning. Then he walked away. Clara watched him. Interesting. Very interesting. Because men often reveal themselves when nobody thinks they're being observed. And what she saw was not a failing rancher. Not yet. She saw competence. Which meant something else had to be wrong. Something bigger. Something hidden. The question settled quietly into the back of her mind. And stayed there. The town of Red Creek sat 7 miles away. Small. Growing. Opinionated. Like most Colorado towns of the era. The church arrangement became public knowledge before Clara had even unpacked her suitcase. News traveled quickly in places where entertainment traveled slowly. By the end of the week, nearly everyone knew. The orphan bride, the struggling rancher, the failing property, the arrangement. At Martha Ellison's general store, the discussion occupied most of a Wednesday afternoon. Poor girl. Poor Samuel. I give it 6 months. That's generous. The customers nodded. People enjoy predicting disasters. It makes them feel wise. Martha herself remained undecided. She stood behind a counter weighing flour. What if she surprises everyone? The room grew briefly quiet. Then laughter followed. Not cruel laughter. Confident laughter. The laughter of people certain they already know how a story ends. Meanwhile, Clara spent her days walking the property. Not aimlessly. Systematically. She inspected fences, water sources, storage sheds, pastures, supply inventories, equipment, the cattle, especially the cattle. Samuel noticed. At first, he assumed curiosity, then boredom, then something else entirely. 3 days after her arrival, he found her standing beside the north pasture, making notes. Actual notes. In a notebook, she was studying the herd, not admiring them. Studying them. Something wrong? Samuel asked. Clara glanced up. No. A pause. Something's unusual. That answer interested him immediately. Unusual how? She pointed toward the grazing field. You have too many cattle in this section. Samuel blinked. Most newcomers struggled to tell one cow from another. This girl had been there less than a week. You can tell that already? She shrugged. The grass can. He stared at her. Clara returned to her notebook. The conversation ended. But Samuel thought about it for the rest of the day. Because she was right. Again, The north pasture was being overused. He had known it, just not consciously. Not until she said it aloud. A week later, she asked about feed contracts, then transportation costs, then grain suppliers, then maintenance schedules, then equipment depreciation. Questions, endless questions, questions that moved strangely, not random, connected, each one leading naturally to the next, like pieces of a puzzle she could somehow see before anyone else did. Eventually, Samuel laughed. The first genuine laugh she had heard from him. Do you ever stop asking questions? Clara considered that seriously. No. He nodded. Fair enough. The answer seemed to satisfy them both. October arrived. The mountains gathered snow. The mornings grew colder. The ranch continued struggling. Bills accumulated. Repairs multiplied. Profits remained scarce. Yet Clara never complained. Not once. That surprised Samuel most of all. Most people arriving at Hart Ranch saw problems. Clara saw information. There was a difference. One evening she stood beside the windmill, studying its damaged blade. Samuel joined her. It bothers you, doesn't it? He looked upward. The windmill? The fact that it's broken. He laughed softly. It bothers me that everything's broken. The wind moved through the grass. The sun lowered behind the mountains. Clara looked at the ranch, the fences, the barns, the cattle, the house, the land. Then she looked back at the windmill. No, she said quietly. I think most things could be fixed. Samuel looked at her. The certainty in her voice startled him. Not optimism, not wishful thinking. Certainty. As if she had spent her entire life proving that statement true. The moment lingered, then passed. But Samuel remembered it, because it was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss Clara Whitmore as simply an orphan sent west by a church. She was something else. He just hadn't figured out what yet. And neither had she. The answer began revealing itself 2 weeks later, on a cold evening, with a ledger book, and a question nobody else had thought to ask. The ranch house sat quiet beneath the glow of a single oil lamp. Outside, the wind pushed softly against the walls. Inside, Samuel worked through invoices at the kitchen table. Numbers, debts, payments, the arithmetic of survival. Clara sat across from him, reading, or at least appearing to. After nearly an hour, she closed her book, reached toward the stack of ranch ledgers, and began flipping through them. Samuel barely noticed. Everyone ignored accounting books until accounting books became emergencies. Several minutes passed. Then more. The lamp crackled softly. Pages turned. Outside, the windmill creaked in darkness. Finally, Clara stopped. She looked down at one specific column. Then another. Then another. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Samuel noticed. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. She studied the figures once more. Carefully, methodically, the way a hunter studies tracks. Then she looked up, very calmly, very quietly, and said, You're not losing money where everyone thinks you are. Silence. The words settled between them. Samuel stared, because for the first time in nearly 3 years, someone had looked at the numbers and seen something he hadn't, something nobody had, and deep down, before she explained a single thing, he already knew she was right. The wind touched the windows. The lamp flickered. And for the first time since Clara Whitmore stepped off a train, carrying everything she owned in a single suitcase, the future shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. And neither of them yet understood how much that single observation was about to change. The difference between intelligence and wisdom is that intelligence notices what is wrong. Wisdom notices why. For most of her life, Clara Whitmore had survived by paying attention. Now, for the first time, paying attention was beginning to change something larger than herself. The evening after she made her observation about the ranch accounts, Samuel Hart slept poorly, not because he disagreed with her. Quite the opposite. Because the moment she spoke, something deep inside him had recognized the truth. The numbers were wrong, not the calculations, the assumptions. For nearly 3 years, Samuel had believed he understood why Hart Ranch was failing. Drought, bad markets, bad luck, The same explanations everyone else repeated. The same explanations that sounded reasonable enough to become accepted as fact. But facts and truth are not always the same thing. The following morning before sunrise, Clara was already sitting at the kitchen table. The ledger book lay open beside a steaming cup of coffee. Columns of figures stretched across the pages. Purchases, invoices, transport fees, feed costs, equipment expenses, months of numbers, years of numbers, patterns hiding inside patterns. Samuel entered quietly. He expected her to be reading. Instead, she was working. Her pencil moved steadily across a sheet of paper, calculating, comparing, cross-referencing. The notebook beside her was already filled with notes. Samuel stopped beside the table. "You've been up long?" Clara glanced toward the window. The horizon was only beginning to lighten. "Since 4. He looked at the clock, then back at her. "Why?" The answer came without hesitation. "Because something doesn't make sense." Samuel pulled out a chair, sat down, and for the next hour, Clara showed him something nobody else had noticed. Not the bank, not the suppliers, not the neighboring ranchers, not even Samuel himself. One transportation company had quietly increased its rates every season. Not enough to attract attention, just enough to avoid questions. A few dollars here, a few dollars there, year after year. By themselves, the increases seemed insignificant. Together, they were draining thousands. Samuel stared at the figures. The realization settled slowly, like a storm moving across open country. How did I miss this? Clara closed the ledger. "You were busy trying to save the ranch." A pause. People don't always see the trap when they're fighting the fire. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, because once again, she was right. And that was becoming difficult to ignore. Over the following weeks, more discoveries followed. One supplier had been charging premium prices for average quality feed. Another consistently delivered short shipments. Several contracts had not been renegotiated in years. The ranch was paying far more than necessary for equipment repairs. And the cattle themselves revealed another problem, one that nobody expected Clara to understand. The grazing rotations were inefficient. Too much pressure on some pastures, too little on others. The result was declining productivity, lower weight gain, higher feed expenses, smaller profits. Samuel listened, questioned, verified, and eventually accepted, not because Clara demanded it, because the evidence kept proving her right. Again, and again, and again. Small changes followed, then larger ones. A new feed supplier, revised transportation agreements, different grazing schedules, inventory controls, maintenance records, systems, processes, discipline. Nothing dramatic, nothing exciting, just hundreds of small decisions made correctly. The kind of improvements most people never notice until the results become impossible to ignore. Winter arrived. Snow settled across the mountains. The windmill turned against gray skies. And for the first time in years, Hart Ranch began moving in the right direction. Slowly, almost invisibly, but undeniably. Samuel noticed it first in the numbers, then in the cattle, then in himself. The constant pressure pressing against his chest seemed slightly lighter, the exhaustion slightly less heavy. Hope is a strange thing. When absent, you barely remember what it feels like. When it returns, even in small amounts, everything changes. One afternoon, Samuel found Clara repairing a broken gate, not directing someone else, doing it herself. Her sleeves rolled up, hands dirty, hair pulled back against the wind. The scene made him pause. Most people who arrived from the city complained about ranch life. Most visitors disliked the work. Clara seemed fascinated by it, not romanticized. Fascinated, as though every challenge represented a problem waiting to be solved. You don't have to do that yourself. She looked up. The gate disagrees. Samuel laughed. The sound surprised both of them, not because it was funny, because it felt natural. That was happening more often lately. Conversation no longer required effort. Silences no longer felt awkward. Partnership had arrived quietly. Neither of them noticed exactly when, only that it existed, Respect came first. Trust followed. Everything else remained unspoken. For now. Meanwhile, the town continued watching and talking, especially talking. At Martha Ellison's general store, opinions flowed almost as freely as coffee. The girl's getting involved in ranch business. That's what I hear. Samuel should know better. She's 19. What could she possibly know about cattle? The conversations repeated themselves daily. Different voices. Same conclusion. People rarely resist success itself. They resist who they think deserves it. And many believe Clara Whitmore did not belong in business. At least not serious business. Not county-level business. Not land business. Not money business. The criticism reached Samuel eventually, as criticism always does. One evening a neighboring rancher offered advice. Uninvited advice. The most common kind. You ought to keep her focused on the house. Samuel looked up from the corral fence he was repairing. The man shrugged. I'm just saying. Samuel returned to his work, then said, quietly, funny thing. What? The people questioning her judgment are usually the same people who never look at their own books. The conversation ended there. Word of that exchange spread through town by the following morning. So did something else. Hart Ranch was improving. The rumors became impossible to ignore. Bills were being paid. Repairs were being completed. The cattle looked healthier. The property looked stronger. Questions followed. Then curiosity. Then concern. Because every improvement on Hart Ranch created a problem for someone else. And no one understood that better than Harold Benton. Harold Benton owned more land than anyone in the county. More cattle. More businesses. More influence. His bank held notes on half the struggling ranches in the region, including Hart Ranch. For years Benton had expected Samuel's property to become available. Not immediately, but eventually. Foreclosure was simply a matter of time. Or so he believed. Then the reports changed. The bank manager mentioned improving revenues. A supplier mentioned renegotiated contracts. A surveyor mentioned unusual land inquiries. Small details. Harold paid attention to details. Successful men usually do. One snowy afternoon, he stood beside the window of his office overlooking Main Street. A thick file rested on his desk. Hart Ranch. The folder was thinner than he expected, yet somehow more interesting. He opened it, read through several reports, then stopped. One sentence caught his attention. 3 words. Clara Whitmore. The name appeared again, and again, and again. Harold leaned back in his chair. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Not quite amusement, not quite concern. Something between the two. He closed the file, walked to the window, and looked out across the town. The buildings, the streets, the businesses, the county he had spent 20 years learning to control. Powerful men often recognize danger long before anyone else sees it. Not because they are smarter, because they are watching, always watching. And something about this orphan girl had begun appearing in too many conversations, too many reports, too many improvements, too many unexpected places. Weeks later, Hart Ranch completed something it had not accomplished in years, a profitable quarter. The amount itself wasn't extraordinary. The significance was... Samuel stared at the figures late one evening while Clara worked nearby. The numbers were real, verified, undeniable. For the first time in years, the ranch had earned more than it spent, not survived, profited, a simple difference on paper, a life-changing difference in reality. Samuel sat quietly, looking at the ledger, then at Clara, then back at the ledger. The foreclosure that had haunted every decision for years suddenly felt less certain, less inevitable. Samuel stepped closer. What are those? Clara didn't look up. Land. I can see that. She smiled faintly, one of those rare smiles that appeared without warning, then vanished. I bought another parcel. Samuel stared. Another one? Yes. A long silence followed. Not angry. Concerned. Samuel sat down, looked at the map, then at Clara, then back at the map. For the first time in months, uncertainty appeared in his expression, not because he doubted her intelligence, because he trusted it. And that somehow made this more frightening. Clara, what if you're wrong? The room grew quiet. The question lingered. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Inside, Clara studied the map, then folded her hands. If I'm wrong, she paused. If I'm wrong, I lose money. Samuel nodded. And if you're right? This time she looked directly at him. The confidence in her eyes startled him. Not arrogance. Conviction. A completely different thing. If I'm right, another pause. We'll never worry about foreclosure again. Samuel looked away, because that answer frightened him even more. Hope can be dangerous, especially when it asks you to risk something. For weeks the disagreement lingered. Never hostile, never bitter, but real. Samuel worried about debt, about appearances, about being laughed at, about gambling hard-earned stability on speculation. Clara worried about something else entirely, missing the opportunity. The tension remained, quiet, persistent, like distant thunder. And meanwhile the town began talking again. At Martha Ellison's general store, the conversations grew louder. She's buying land. I heard. The dry parcels? Those dry parcels. Laughter followed. Predictably, people often mock what they don't understand, especially when understanding would require imagination. One rancher shook his head. Girls gone crazy. Another nodded. Samuel finally gets the ranch stable, and now she's throwing money into rocks. The room erupted with agreement. Martha remained silent, which was unusual. Finally, someone asked her opinion. She shrugged. I've noticed something. What? The people calling her foolish. A pause. Keep talking about her. Silence followed, not because they agreed, because they couldn't argue. And across town, someone else had begun paying attention. Harold Benton, the most powerful man in the county, the man who expected Hart Ranch to become his years ago. At first, the reports amused him. The orphan girl buying worthless land, the struggling ranch investing in useless acreage. Ridiculous, almost entertaining. Then the reports continued. One parcel, then another, always near certain routes, certain corridors, certain overlooked regions. Harold stopped laughing, because powerful people rarely survive by dismissing patterns. One afternoon, he spread several county maps across his office desk. Survey notes, property records, ownership filings, purchase agreements. For nearly an hour, he studied them, then suddenly stopped. A realization settled across his face. The same realization Clara had reached months earlier. Only now it came with a problem. A serious problem. Several of the parcels he intended to acquire already belonged to Clara Whitmore. His eyes narrowed. He reviewed the maps again. And again, the conclusion remained unchanged. She owned key positions, critical positions, land directly connected to the routes his investors wanted. For the first time in years, Harold Benton felt something unfamiliar. Concern, not fear, not yet, but concern. The kind that arrives when an opponent proves smarter than expected. Back at Hart Ranch, Clara remained unaware of the effect she was having. She continued buying carefully, planning quietly, studying constantly, waiting, because strategy often requires patience. And patience was something life had taught her in abundance. Then summer arrived, and with it, the moment everything changed. The railroad surveyors came. 3 wagons, several engineers, stacks of equipment, dozens of measuring rods. The county buzzed with excitement. People gathered to watch, speculate, guess. Entire businesses paused simply to observe where the crews traveled. By afternoon, survey markers began appearing across the countryside. White stakes driven into open ground. Small pieces of wood, yet somehow capable of changing fortunes. The county watched and waited. One marker appeared, then another, then another. The line stretched westward, cutting across valleys, fields, pastures, properties. Each new stake raised new questions. Each new stake increased attention. By sunset, a crowd had gathered near one of the survey crews. Harold Benton arrived. So did neighboring ranchers. So did merchants, bankers. Speculators. Everyone wanted to know, where would the railroad go? The lead surveyor hammered another marker into the ground, checked his notes, then continued forward. The crowd followed. The line advanced steadily across the landscape, a few hundred yards, then another few hundred, then over a ridge, then down into a shallow valley, and finally toward land owned by Clara Whitmore. The surveyor stopped, measured again, checked his documents, then drove a fresh marker directly into the soil. The crowd fell silent. Harold Benton stared. The marker stood exactly where he feared it would, on Clara's property. One parcel, then another, then another. The route continued, crossing land she had quietly assembled while everyone else laughed. The realization spread to the crowd like wildfire. People exchanged glances. Murmurs grew louder. Questions followed. And standing beside the newly placed survey marker, for the first time, everyone began understanding exactly what Clara Whitmore had seen, months before anyone else. The wind moved through the grass. The white survey stakes stretched across the valley, and somewhere behind the crowd, Harold Benton's expression changed, because the most powerful man in the county had just discovered something deeply unsettling. The orphan girl he underestimated might be holding the future of the entire county in her hands. Most people think fortunes are built in a single moment, a lucky investment, a brilliant decision, a sudden opportunity. But when historians look back at lives that change entire communities, they usually discover something different. The moment everyone notices is rarely the moment everything began. The real work happened earlier, quietly, patiently, invisible to almost everyone. And standing beside those railroad survey stakes, the people of Red Creek were finally beginning to understand that they had misunderstood Clara Whitmore from the very beginning. Not because she had gotten lucky, because she had been planning. For a very long time, the crowd remained gathered long after surveyors finished their work. Men who normally hurried home for supper lingered beside fences. Merchants left stores unattended. Ranchers stood in small groups studying maps and arguing over routes. The county had become obsessed overnight, because railroads did not merely move trains. They moved money, businesses, families, entire futures. Where rails went, prosperity often followed. And wherever prosperity followed, land values transformed. The survey stakes cutting across Clara's properties represented far more than dirt. They represented leverage, possibility, influence, the things powerful men value most. That evening, Samuel returned to the ranch house, carrying a folded county map beneath one arm. The kitchen table was already covered with papers, property records, tax filings, survey notices, purchase agreements. Clara sat beneath the lantern light, studying them. The familiar notebook rested beside her, the same notebook she had carried west in a worn suitcase, the same notebook she had filled with observations nobody else considered important. Samuel placed the map on the table, then slowly unfolded it. The room fell quiet. Outside, the windmill turned against the darkness. Inside, a different kind of machinery was becoming visible, the machinery of Clara's mind. Samuel looked at the map, then at Clara, then back at the map. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he pointed toward the railroad route, then toward her properties, then toward another parcel, and another, and another. The pattern revealed itself, not randomly, perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle finally arranged into their intended shape. His eyes widened, because for the first time, he saw the entire picture. Every purchase, every question, every conversation, every risk, every apparently foolish decision. Connected, not separate events. A strategy, months of planning, years of preparation. A vision nobody else had recognized. Samuel sat down slowly, the realization settling across him like sunrise across open land. You knew. Clara looked up. Knew what? The route. No. A faint smile touched her lips. I knew there would be a route. The distinction mattered, and Samuel understood immediately. She had not predicted the future. She had prepared for it. There is a difference. One depends on luck. The other depends on understanding how the world works. Samuel leaned back in his chair, shook his head softly, almost laughing, not because it was funny, because it was astonishing. For months the county had been debating whether Clara Whitmore was reckless. Now, he realized the county had been asking the wrong question entirely. The question was not whether she was reckless. The question was whether anyone else had been paying attention. The railroad announcement changed everything. Within weeks, land speculators began arriving from neighboring counties, then neighboring states, developers, investors, railroad representatives, businessmen carrying briefcases full of contracts. Suddenly the land nobody wanted became the land everybody wanted. Auction prices doubled, then tripled, then doubled again. Parcels once ignored for years became the subject of bidding wars. Property owners who had laughed at Clara now searched desperately for maps, trying to understand what she understood, trying to recover opportunities they had already missed. The transformation happened so quickly it felt unreal. Fields once considered worthless now attracted investors. Dusty acreage became valuable. Neglected property became strategic property. And at the center of all of it stood Clara Whitmore, the orphan girl who arrived carrying everything she owned in a single suitcase. The county struggled to understand it, because people often prefer stories that make sense. Stories where success arrives through inheritance, education, connections, privilege. Those stories feel predictable, comfortable. Clara's story felt different, and that made many people uneasy. At Martha Ellison's general store, the conversations changed. Not completely, but noticeably. The laughter disappeared first, then the mockery, then the certainty. One afternoon a rancher unfolded a newspaper and muttered, "How much land does she actually own?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Another man shook his head. "I should have bought those parcels myself." Martha continued arranging inventory, then said quietly, "But you didn't." The room fell silent. Again, because once again, she was right. Across the county, one man was having a far worse week. Harold Benton. For years, Harold had operated from a simple assumption. Everything eventually became available. Land, businesses, influence, people. Given enough money and enough time, everything could be purchased. That belief had served him well. Until Clara. The first offer arrived discreetly. Professional. Generous. A representative visited Hart Ranch carrying documents. The proposal was straightforward. Harold wished to purchase several parcels at an extremely favorable price. The offer exceeded market value substantially. Many ranchers would have accepted immediately. Most would have considered it a miracle. Clara read the paperwork, then handed it back. "No," the representative blinked. "I'm not sure you understand the amount." "I understand it." A pause. "No." The answer traveled back to Harold. The second offer arrived 2 weeks later. Larger. Much larger. Again Clara refused. The third offer became difficult to ignore. The kind of number capable of changing a family's life forever. Samuel stared at the paperwork, then at Clara, then back at the paperwork. The amount represented security, comfort, a future free from financial worry, at least for most people. "You aren't tempted?" Samuel asked. Clara folded the document, set aside, then looked toward the window, toward the land stretching beyond the ranch. For a moment she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an unusual softness, not uncertainty. "Memory. I've spent most of my life belonging to circumstances." Samuel remained silent, listening, carefully. "When my parents died..." She paused. The words arrived slowly, as though crossing years to reach the surface. "The church decided where I lived." Another pause. Other people decided what happened next. The room grew still. Outside, evening settled across the valley. The windmill turned. Steady, persistent. "I don't want wealth." She said it so quietly Samuel almost missed it. Then she looked directly at him. "I want choices." Something shifted inside Samuel. A realization. Not about land. Not about money. About Clara. For months he had been trying to understand her ambition. Trying to understand why ownership mattered so much. Now he finally did. The land itself was never the goal. Security was. Freedom was. Ownership meant independence. Independence meant safety. And safety was something Clara Whitmore had been searching for her entire life. The realization hit him harder than he expected, because suddenly every decision made perfect sense. The calculations, the risks, the persistence, the refusal to sell. None of it was greed. It was self-preservation. On a scale larger than anyone imagined, Samuel looked away, toward the window, toward the fading light, and for the first time, he saw Clara not merely as intelligent, not merely as capable, but as someone who had spent years building the one thing she never received as a child, a foundation nobody could take away. Meanwhile, the rest of the county was learning a different lesson. Power had shifted, slowly, then suddenly. The men who once dismissed Clara now sought meetings. Bankers requested appointments. Developers requested negotiations. Landowners requested partnerships. Every conversation seemed to begin the same way, with respect, the respect they should have shown years earlier. And every one of those conversations reminded Harold Benton of an uncomfortable truth. He no longer controlled the board. Someone else held the critical pieces. The realization irritated him, then angered him, then frightened him, because Harold Benton understood power better than most, and power rarely surrenders gracefully. One evening, he sat alone in his office long after sunset. Maps covered the desk. Contracts, property records, correspondence. The room glowed beneath a single lamp. Harold studied the documents, searching, calculating, looking for weakness. There had to be one. Everyone had one. Eventually his eyes settled on an old filing, a legal detail, small, technical, complicated, the sort of thing most people overlook. Harold read it twice, then a third time, slowly, very slowly, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not the smile of victory, the smile of possibility. Because if the filing meant what he thought it meant, then Clara's entire position might be vulnerable. Every parcel, every investment, every acre, at risk. The next morning, attorneys began receiving instructions. Investigators began reviewing records. Documents began disappearing into briefcases. Across the county, nobody noticed. Not yet. At Hart Ranch, the windmill continued turning. The cattle grazed peacefully. The railroad plans advanced. And Clara Whitmore believed the most difficult part of the journey might finally be behind her. But powerful men rarely accept defeat quietly. And Harold Benton had just launched something far more dangerous than a business negotiation, a legal challenge, one capable of unraveling everything she had built, one capable of destroying every acre she fought to secure, one capable of turning victory into disaster. And this time, the threat was coming from a direction Clara never saw coming. There are moments when a person's entire life seems to narrow into a single room, a single decision, a single verdict, a single sentence. For Clara Whitmore, that moment arrived on a bright September morning beneath the white stone walls of the Red Creek County Courthouse. Long before sunrise, people had already begun gathering. Farm wagons lined the streets. Horses crowded hitching posts. Store owners delayed opening their businesses. Ranchers postponed work. Families arrived carrying folding chairs. The entire county seemed drawn toward the courthouse as though pulled by gravity itself, because everyone understood what was happening. At least they thought they did. Officially, the hearing concerned land ownership, property filings, railroad rights, contract validity, legal technicalities. But nobody came to watch paperwork. They came to watch a battle. The richest man in the county against the orphan girl they once mocked. The old courthouse clock struck 9. Its sound echoed across Main Street. Inside, every seat was occupied. The air felt heavy, warm, restless. Whispers drifted through the room like wind moving through dry grass. At the front sat Harold Benton, immaculately dressed, perfectly composed. His silver watch chain caught the morning light. His attorneys occupied the table beside him. Stacks of documents rose in neat piles. Years of influence sat comfortably on his shoulders. He looked exactly like what people expected power to look like. Confident, established, untouchable. On the opposite side of the room sat Clara Whitmore. No expensive suit, no display of wealth, no attempt at intimidation. Just a simple dark dress, a notebook, and the same calm expression she carried the day she stepped off a train with a torn suitcase and nowhere else to go. Samuel sat beside her. Neither spoke much. There was nothing left to say. The arguments had already been prepared. The evidence already gathered. Now the outcome belonged to something else. The truth, or whatever the courtroom decided truth happened to be. The judge entered. The room rose, then settled again. Silence followed. The kind of silence that exists only when hundreds of people suddenly stop talking at once. The proceedings began. At first, everything felt ordinary. Legal language, procedural questions, document reviews, ownership histories, dates, signatures, filings. The rhythm moved slowly, methodically, but beneath the surface, tension gathered, because everyone understood where this was heading. Harold's attorneys presented their argument first. They spoke confidently, skillfully, years of courtroom experience evident in every sentence. According to their claim, irregularities existed in several early transactions. Certain parcels had changed hands under questionable circumstances. Documentation might not satisfy legal requirements. Survey classifications could potentially invalidate ownership chains. Technical arguments, complicated arguments, the kind designed to confuse, the kind designed to overwhelm. The audience listened carefully, and as the hours passed, uncertainty began spreading through the room. People exchanged glances. Whispers returned. Could Harold actually win? Could Clara lose everything? Samuel felt the tension growing beside him. For the first time in months, genuine fear appeared. Not fear for the ranch. Not fear for the money. Fear for Clara. Because he knew what the land truly represented. Not wealth. Safety. And there is a difference. Across the aisle, Harold remained calm, almost relaxed, as though he could already see the outcome, as though the ending had already been written. Then Clara's attorneys began presenting their evidence, and the atmosphere changed, slowly at first, then all at once. One contract, then another, purchase records, tax receipts, witness statements, survey certifications, every document verified, every signature authenticated, every transfer legally executed. The piles of evidence continued growing, page after page, year after year, transaction after transaction. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. Nothing had been accidental, nothing careless, nothing improper. Everything had been documented with extraordinary precision, because Clara had anticipated resistance long before anyone realized she needed protection. The courtroom began noticing. So did Harold. The confidence in his expression faded slightly, only slightly, but enough. Then came the moment nobody forgot, the moment that lived in county memory for decades afterward. Clara took the stand. The courtroom watched, every seat occupied, every eye fixed upon her. The young woman walked forward calmly. No dramatic gestures, no display, no performance, just quiet certainty. She took her oath, sat down, and waited. The questioning began. At first, the attorneys focused on transactions, dates, purchases, property selections, the mechanics of her investments. Clara answered every question, clearly, precisely, without hesitation. The audience listened, gradually realizing something. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't fortune. This was intelligence. Disciplined intelligence. The rarest kind. Eventually one attorney leaned forward, his voice measured, controlled. You purchased these properties knowing they might increase in value. Yes. You intended to profit. Yes. A pause. The attorney glanced toward the jury box, toward the crowd, then back toward Clara. So this was about acquiring wealth. The room grew quiet. Something about the question felt important. The attorneys sensed it. The audience sensed it. Even Samuel sensed it. For a brief moment, Clara said nothing. She looked toward the courthouse windows. Sunlight streamed through the glass. Dust drifted lazily in the air. And perhaps for a moment, she wasn't seeing the courtroom at all. Perhaps she was seeing a church dormitory, a narrow bed, a childhood spent belonging to circumstances, to decisions made by other people, to a future she never controlled. When she finally spoke, her voice carried through the entire room. Steady, clear, unshaken. People spend their lives trying to own land. Silence settled immediately. Not courtroom silence. Something deeper. The kind created when everyone realizes they're hearing the truth. Clara continued. I spent mine making sure nobody could ever own me. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the attorneys remained still. Because suddenly the case wasn't about acreage, or railroads, or contracts. It was about freedom, the deepest human desire of all. The words seemed to hang in the room long after she finished speaking. And for the first time, the county truly understood her. Not the investor, not the landowner, not the strategist. The orphan, the little girl who learned early that security was never guaranteed. The woman who refused to remain vulnerable ever again. The questioning continued, but something fundamental had changed. The room was no longer evaluating Clara. It was understanding her. Hour by hour, document by document, the truth became impossible to ignore. Every transaction was legal. Every purchase valid. Every contract secure. Every accusation collapsed beneath evidence. One argument after another dissolved. The legal challenge weakened, then weakened further, then disappeared entirely. By late afternoon, even Harold's attorneys understood the outcome. The judge understood it. The audience understood it. Harold understood it. The verdict arrived shortly before sunset. The judge reviewed the findings, reviewed the evidence, reviewed the filings, then delivered the decision. Every claim rejected, every ownership right affirmed, every parcel confirmed. The courtroom remained silent for half a heartbeat. Then the realization arrived. Harold Benton had lost. Not partially, not technically, completely. Years of influence, years of assumptions, years of power. Defeated by a woman many people once considered a burden. Across the room, Harold sat motionless. The expression on his face was impossible to read. Shock, anger, disbelief, perhaps all three. But for the first time anyone could remember, Harold Benton looked small. Not physically, symbolically. The illusion had broken, and everyone saw it. Samuel turned toward Clara. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Some victories exist beyond language. The crowd slowly rose. People began leaving the courtroom. Yet something remarkable happened. As Clara walked toward the exit, conversation stopped. Not because people disapproved, because they respected her. Men who once laughed at her stepped aside. Business owners nodded. Ranchers tipped their hats. Bankers offered handshakes. No announcements were made. No speeches delivered. No formal recognition occurred. Yet everyone felt it. A transformation. The orphan bride had vanished. In her place stood something entirely different. The most capable landowner in the region. A woman who had outplanned the powerful, outworked the experienced, and outlasted everyone who doubted her. Outside, evening sunlight washed across Main Street. The courthouse doors opened. The crowd spilled into the street. And standing at the top of the courthouse steps, Clara paused. The town stretched before her. The same town that once whispered. The same town that once laughed. The same town that once dismissed her. Now silent, watching, waiting, seeing her clearly for the first time. But as the last sunlight touched the courthouse stone, a new question began quietly forming. Because Harold Benton had lost everything he tried to take. His influence, his leverage, his case, his control. And men like Harold Benton rarely walk away from defeat unchanged. Sometimes they surrender. Sometimes they disappear. And sometimes they become dangerous in entirely new ways. 3 years is not a long time. Not in the life of a nation. Not in the life of a county. Not even in the life of a ranch. But sometimes 3 years is enough to transform everything. Enough to change a reputation. Enough to change a future. Enough to change the way history remembers a name. The spring of 1892 arrived warm and bright across Red Creek County. Wildflowers spread across the valleys. Fresh grass rolled over the hills. The railroad line stretched confidently through the landscape where survey stakes once stood. Steam locomotives now crossed land that had been dismissed as worthless only a few years earlier. The county looked different, faster, busier, more prosperous. New businesses lined Main Street. Warehouses rose near the tracks. Homes appeared where empty fields once stood. Investors arrived weekly. Families arrived daily. Opportunity seemed to flow into the region alongside the trains themselves. And beneath nearly every major development, there was one name, Clara Whitmore. The transformation had happened so gradually that most people barely noticed it, at least not at first. One parcel became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 12. Partnerships followed. Leases followed. Strategic sales. Strategic purchases. Careful negotiations. Patient decisions. The same discipline that once saved Hart Ranch now operated on a countywide scale. Never rushed. Never careless. Never emotional. Clara continued approaching every opportunity exactly as she always had. Study first. Understand second. Act third. By the time most people recognized what was happening, the outcome was already unavoidable. One afternoon, a group of businessmen gathered around a county development map. Colored pins marked ownership, railroad access, future projects, industrial sites, commercial districts, residential expansions. One of the men stared at the map, then looked again, then leaned closer. His expression slowly changed. That can't be right. Another man walked over. What? The first pointed toward the map, toward dozens of marked parcels, toward entire corridors of strategic property. The second man's eyes widened. A long silence followed. Finally, he whispered, "My God," because the realization was impossible to ignore. Clara Whitmore now controlled nearly half of the county's most valuable development land. Half. The orphan bride. The girl everyone pitied. The young woman they said would never survive 6 months. Now possessed enough influence to shape the county's future for generations. The title people once used mockingly had disappeared years ago. No one called her the orphan bride anymore. Now they called her something else. The woman who saw it first. The woman who bought what everyone ignored. The woman who changed Red Creek County. And yet, if you visited Hart Ranch, you would have struggled to notice much difference in Clara herself. Success had transformed her circumstances, not her character. The ranch house remained simple. The routines remained familiar. The work never stopped. Because Clara had never been interested in appearances, only outcomes. One quiet evening near the end of summer, she sat at the same kitchen table where everything had begun. The house was peaceful. Outside, golden light settled across the fields. The distant sound of cattle drifted through an open window. The windmill turned steadily against a fading sky. And resting before Clara was an old ledger book. The same ledger, the same worn cover, the same pages. Samuel entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He paused when he saw what she was reading. A smile touched his face, not because of the numbers, because of the memory. 3 years earlier, that ledger had recorded debts, losses, missed opportunities, foreclosure risks, sleepless nights. It had told the story of a ranch slowly losing a battle. Now the pages told a different story. Profits, growth, investments, expansion, security, possibility. The same book, a completely different future. Samuel placed a cup beside her, then looked over her shoulder. The figures stretched across the pages. Healthy, strong, stable, the sort of numbers that once felt impossible. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned. The kind of silence shared only by people who have traveled a long road together. Finally, Samuel pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and looked toward the open window. The sun was lowering, painting the fields gold. The view stretched farther than ever, not because the land had changed, because the future had. For several moments, he remained quiet. Then he said something he had been carrying for a long time. I thought I was saving you when you came here." Clara looked up. The words settled gently between them. There was no pride in his voice, no self-congratulation, only honesty. The simple truth of what he once believed. A struggling rancher offering an orphan a chance at stability. A man trying to help someone he thought needed rescuing. Clara studied him for a moment, then smiled. The smile arrived slowly, warmly, not amused, grateful. "You did." Samuel nodded, but before he could respond, she continued, softly, almost playfully, "You just weren't the only one." For a second he looked confused, then understanding arrived, and with it came laughter. Real laughter, the kind neither of them experienced much 3 years earlier. Because she was right, they had saved each other. Samuel gave Clara a home. Clara gave Samuel a future. The ranch survived because of both of them. The life they built existed because of both of them. Neither had rescued the other alone. The truth was more beautiful than that. They had become stronger together. The evening deepened. The conversation faded. The moment lingered. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The same wind that greeted Clara on the day she arrived. The same wind that turned the damaged windmill when everyone believed the ranch was dying. Only now the windmill no longer groaned. Its broken blade had been replaced years ago. It turned smoothly, steadily, like a promise finally fulfilled. And perhaps that was fitting, because symbols matter, even when people don't realize it. The windmill had survived. The ranch had survived. And so had Clara. The county believed Clara Whitmore arrived with nothing. They were wrong. Very wrong. She arrived with the one thing more valuable than land, more valuable than money, more valuable than inheritance. She arrived with vision, the ability to see possibility where everyone else saw ruin, to recognize value where everyone else saw waste, to imagine a future nobody else could yet see. That gift cannot be inherited. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be taught easily. And once combined with courage, it becomes almost unstoppable. The people who sent Clara west believed they were removing a burden. The town believed they were witnessing a desperate arrangement. The county believed they understood how the story would end. Every one of them was mistaken, because they judged her by what she lacked, not by what she possessed. And life has a habit of rewarding that mistake very harshly. As the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, Clara stepped onto the porch. Samuel joined her. Together, they stood looking across thousands of acres, fields, pastures, rail lines, development corridors, land once dismissed, land once mocked, land now shaping the future of an entire region. The horizon glowed amber, then gold, then deep crimson. The windmill turned slowly against the evening sky. Steady, certain, the county stretched before them. Prosperous, growing, secure, and for the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore knew something with absolute certainty. No one would ever decide her future for her again. The wind moved softly across the ranch. The last sunlight faded, and standing side by side on the porch of a ranch that should have failed, two survivors watched the future arrive, this time on their own terms. The windmill turned once more. The fields shimmered beneath the dying light, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, a reminder of where the journey began, and how far it had come. The end.